Welcome to our week on the domestic responses to the kinds of climate, human security, and conflict challenges we've seen so far. Hope you all are doing well. The last time I tried to record, I ended up spilling half of my water, so that's how my week is going. I'm doing some good marking, and I'm definitely planning on returning literature proposals, research proposals, more quickly than literature reviews, so that's good. I have my coffee, which is good, and we are only a few short weeks away from the end of the semester. So we're entering the third main part of the class. We've spent the first part looking at the main causes of political violence and civil conflict, human security. We've defined all our different outcomes. Second part of the class was looking at specific climate or human security drivers for political violence and looking at how the different interrelationships between background structural conditions like climate change interact with the multidimensional aspects of human security and how all those can affect scarcity, motives, or opportunity for conflict. And for the last 2 weeks, we're going to look at how different types of actors have responded to these challenges, because I think for me the main motivating puzzle for today is try to shift the narrative, right? We've spent the first 10 weeks looking at the myriad drivers of human security and conflict. However, and that's consistent with most of the literature that's tried to understand why negative things occur. Why are there human rights violations? Why are different people repressed by the government or use violence against their own government to try to reach political ends? And there really hasn't been as much work in the political science literature, and I think thinking more broadly this semester on why not. Earlier in the semester, I talked about how I'm a member of the Peace Science Society, and it is my people in different groups, different careers, have a different set of people that you consider your peers. In political science, it's a huge field. The largest conferences in Europe and in the US, you can have over 6,000 political scientists or people who study politics attend them. And there, within that, there are a bunch of smaller groups. And like the rest of humanity, political scientists have unstated assumptions about who's doing good work and who's not, what are topics that are relevant to us and what not. And political science often focuses on the distribution of power and different forms of violence. The Peace Science Society focuses on all that, but I think there's an unstated but increasingly stated explicit assumption that the goal should be, by understanding the why and the how things happened, you can try to prevent negative things like that, from the Rwandan genocide to major world wars to minor civil conflict skirmishes that we've seen around the world. And so I wanted to spend the last 2 weeks of the class on a bit of a more positive note in looking at efforts to try to address the major challenges the class has highlighted, and to help take you after the class into the world with the critical skills to ask your own questions, figure out what you think is a puzzle, and to be able to use those critical thinking skills to help make the world a better place, whether that's your direct causal connection or an indirect effect of what you end up focusing on. And so peace science focuses on not necessarily just the causes of conflict, but also the drivers of a positive peace. And in this class, I want to look at, in these last couple weeks, how governments have taken steps to try to mitigate or adapt to the mechanisms that we've covered in the first 10 weeks of the class. So it's part of the reason we want to focus on this week is to see what's happened in government's responses and learning in a domestic realm this week, and next week we're going to look internationally. But I think it's important to think about what questions we ask. Do they necessarily always have to be framed negatively? Why do things go wrong? while you can also ask the inverse: what makes certain cases go right to economically develop, to address the challenges that are facing states, and can make the world a better place. So, in a lot of ways, I spent the first 10 weeks of the class looking at kind of like the marmot here, looking at the Tibetan fox, these ongoing challenges that are threatening us as individuals and as societies, and then now we're kind of look at how you can kind of respond to it. This was the wildlife winner of the National Geographic photographic contest from a couple of years ago. No, last year, 2019. The 2020 ones I'm really looking forward to. They haven't come out yet. Hopefully people are still out taking pictures. Hopefully next week I'll be able to get outside of my basement here if I get done marking for the last series of lectures. I haven't had any overwhelming thoughts about where to go. If you have any thoughts, feel free to let me know. So yeah, why do people make decisions that they do? And when you're faced with a certain challenge, like impending death from a Tibetan fox, or less directly through long-term climatic or human security challenges, how do you respond? And because I'm from Los Angeles and was raised around a lot of people who worked in the movie industry, it reminded me of a movie that came out way before a lot of you were actually born, but Titanic. I don't know how many of you have seen them. One of the more dramatic scenes was when an old married couple decided not to board the boats, but to console each other in the bed on the Titanic and go down with, and they died. It was actually based on a true story. I believe the gentleman's name was Strauss. He was one of the founders of the Macy's department store in the United States, and originally his wife had access to one of the lifeboats. Once she was on board the boat and he didn't have space because he wouldn't board until all the women and children were off, she got off the boat with him, even though eventually both were offered spaces, and they both went down with the ship. And Titanic is very polarizing. Some people really like Cameron movies. Some people don't. Usually the writing is not the strongest thing, more about the epic scale. I'm of two minds about what's going to happen with the new Avatar movies. But one of the ongoing puzzles about Titanic also relates to the class, albeit tenuously, maybe only in my own mind. Why did she not make space on the door for Leo DiCaprio to climb on board when he was doing press tour for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood within the last year or two? He was asked it, wouldn't comment, and Margot Robbie and Brad Pitt, who are also in the movie, were saying that yeah, he totally could have fit. And it is one of those dramas of our time, right? Why I guess the narrative demanded of it, but theoretically, if you could make those decisions in order to save someone else and make space on your door, would you do it, and why, and to what extent? When faced with these challenges, different people make different decisions. I would have definitely tried to climb on board that door and to try to shove her aside in the interest of both of us surviving and living a happy life. Different people make different decisions, right? So how are states making responses to these overwhelming and sometimes scary challenges that we're all faced with now in 2020? And specifically, the motivating question for today is, how are national and local governments trying to mitigate or adapt to the challenges that we've seen in this semester? And we're really looking at what mitigation and adaptation are, how different people calculate risk for the related to certain behaviors and outcomes, and how do states respond to that risk in either trying to prevent something from happening through mitigating the causes of that outcome from happening, or adapting to those outcomes and either moving or trying to develop an environment that can allow them to survive it. So those are the motivating puzzle, right? Why didn't Jack get on the raft? Why didn't she invite him? And how do different states make decisions that in retrospect can be seen as successful or not? And given the existential nature of these kind of climate change events that we've seen so far in the class, why are different governments around the world making different decisions, right? So motivating question, and you can kind of think of a couple of examples of how different countries have responded in different ways. Genocide is probably the most dramatic example of negative use of political violence, trying to exterminate in whole or in part a group of people due to some kind of identity aspect or political aspect. The Rwandan case we looked at a couple of weeks ago, and in the response after the 1994 conflict and genocide, there was the International Tribunal to hold people to account for genocide in Arusha, Tanzania, and there were domestic efforts to try to create more micro-level courts. The court system in Rwanda couldn't necessarily arrest, detain forever a large percentage of the population that might have used violence against their neighbors. And so one of the efforts to try to have some kind of justice to allow victims and victims' families to move forward, as well as to have a clear airing of what's happened, was through Gashasa courts. And this system was seen as a success in the perpetrators admitting what they did, and the victims being able to hear that and to recount what happened in full view of everyone around. So there was some kind of accountability. And Laura C.A., who writes a great series of articles for the Monkey Cage blog in Washington Post. They have an African book she has with a couple of others, a really great African politics reading list that comes out every summer if you're interested in African politics before my class next year. Conflict and Change in Sub-Saharan Africa, second semester 2021. Look for it. It's going to happen next year. But her blog and her Twitter account, Texas in Africa, provides a lot of really interesting takes on topics that are related to this class. And she talks about the complicated nature of the Gashasa courts, who held them, who spoke, and what the long-term effects of them are. And so you can see that as one kind of domestic response. You have this international response through international courts. You did have courts in Kigali and other parts of Rwanda hold some of the leaders to account, but for the rank and file, these were a kind of effort. But as with a lot of things that we've looked at in this class, there are push and pull factors and successes and drawbacks. When we look at a lot of the responses to the kind of outcomes we're going to talk about today, often we'll focus on national level politics, national level leaders, and international efforts of cooperation that we're going to look at next week. But I also wanted to draw your attention to some of the initiatives by subnational parties. This Guardian article talks about Australian local councils leading the way. It reminds me of California, the California state legislature instigating a lot of, or passing a lot of policies that were ahead of their time that later, it's called the lab of democracy. It starts in California, and if something works, other states around the U.S. will adopt it. In the national climate in which there might be structural constraints to actually doing something at the national level, you can have states, provinces, local councils, or mayors that will often make their own policies to be able to respond. And so for your research proposals and for your essays, as well as just different outcomes that we look at in this class, it's useful to kind of think about whether national level politics, which is what often gets in the newspaper, is really what's driving broad change, or whether you can look at other types of levels. For example, in the ACT, right, we're still a territory, not a state. There's a number of resources about adapting to climate change. We're going to talk about a bit of the several efforts that people are taking at a subnational level, including here in the ACT. unfortunately, it can be politicized. It's there was warning that climate change could become politicized in Canada, and you think of if this is back in 2019, if Canada has to worry about it, then you know that it's been politicized in a lot of different places. Although Canada is an interesting case because you have kind of like Australia, a huge resource extraction sector in often remote part of the country, and then you have different people who might be more activist in trying to shape policies to minimize carbon emissions or spending towards environmental protection, and that can cause tensions in countries just outside of Australia. Shifting to researchers and academics like me, I think as much as I would like the World Bank or international organizations of policymakers to listen to academics, it can be quite difficult. And in a lot of the articles that we've read for this semester, you've seen the messiness and the difficulty in conveying results that really show that what you see going on is actually what's going on. That because of all the other different factors in those complicated path diagrams, that how can we be sure that this one factor is really the most important? And we haven't spent that much time talking about a kind of research design that gains broader acceptance in some areas of foreign aid policy and in domestic health policy, probably more than political or social policy, is the randomized control trial. And in the Nobel Peace Prize this year was given to the World Health Organization for their efforts, and we've used some of the World Health Organization reports in this semester. The last year's Nobel Prize in Economics, or the name is a lot longer, but it's basically often referred to as the Nobel Prize in Economics, were to three academics. The first two are at MIT. I'm not sure if Michael Kremer is, probably is, but they helped pioneer the use of randomized control trials in order to study development, broadly defined, increasing human security in developing countries. And this is a method that was taken from other fields in which you try to randomly assign participants to either receiving the treatment, some kind of policy, or not, and then seeing whether they have an effect. I looked at a lot of studies in my dissertation for projects related to microfinance, and randomized control trials were seen as the gold standard to really see whether there is a causal effect. And for your research papers, it'd be interesting to see if you can come across any articles that use this kind of methodology to really isolate in a credible way that what you think is having a strong causal relationship to the other is actually having that relationship. And so in trying to look at how we develop domestic responses, this is kind of the gold standard. And most of the policies that we're going to look at don't really reach that so far in trying to address broad political outcomes, though when trying to deal with carbon dioxide emissions, those kind of fields, the supercomputers that they develop and they run much more complex models than we will because they have much more data than we have. But you can see the overlap in the way that we try to understand the world and what kind of policies are likely to have an effect, which we're gonna look at later on today. I'll end this introduction with a couple of examples of how important it is in 2020 and in future years at trying to get the public to go along with you. As we see with the insanity of the US presidential election that's going to be settled in the next couple of weeks, public sentiment and public preferences are shifting, but what people want and the information that they get can be contingent, and the assumptions that we have in this class about what's going on in your knowledge that you've developed over the last 10 weeks, you maybe will take for granted, as well as just in the last 3 or 4 years of your degree. I wanted to kind of end this section by kind of showing how far you've come and how important education and reputable sources of information are to providing that domestic support for policies that we're going to see in the next couple weeks. So this recent article, oh, it's 2015 article, was looking at polling about climate change, and I wanted to kind of contrast this with more recent polling to kind of show how quickly and how far we've come since 2015, and what an effect people like Greta Thunberg and the Paris Climate Accords and the IPCC that we're going to look at next week have had an effect. So if you see here with this study here, the public awareness of climate change is much higher in those darker blue states in Europe, in North America, South America, Southeast Asia, and Australia. Knowledge of climate change is systematically different in South Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's an open question, and I'm not a communications or public policy expert by any means, but you can see over the course of the semester economic development, political security, and awareness of these issues can often cluster in different areas. A more recent study, this is the most recent one that I could find from Gallup, for a global poll of the global perceptions of the threat of climate change, suggests that the vast majority of people think that it's somewhat or a very serious threat. Only 13% said it's not a threat at all. 18% say that they don't know. And it's interesting to kind of see where those don't know stand, right? And in a lot of ways, those don't knows are shaped quite dramatically by the educational opportunities that people have. That across all different years of education, the more education you have, the more that you believe, the more that the general population thinks that climate change is a very serious threat. The differences aren't quite as dramatic in 0 to 8 years of education, but 16 plus, the majority of people believe that it's a very serious threat. Where people who think this is not a serious threat are also interesting, especially since we're going to be looking at Nepal, as we did last week. This week, that the number 2 country who people who don't know or refuse to answer the question were in Nepal. And you see other countries, including Bangladesh, that are quite dramatically affected by systematic changes in weather patterns, are also still have a third of the population that don't know or refuse to answer. How ready are you? How much do you know about this? I'll bring this really to a close by tying it back to the ACT, that there is a questionnaire that you can answer to figure out. I don't know if BuzzFeed has stolen this or whether they got the idea from all those kind of listicles you have out there, but you can find out about the major threats and the domestic responses on the ACT website: bushfires, heat waves, severe storms, and droughts. It's going to be an interesting summer. So with that, I want to segue first to break it up with a couple of brief videos looking at clever ways of either trying to adapt or unanticipated consequences of the kind of change we've seen so far. The first one is, I showed a picture of it, I think, earlier in the semester, of Bangladeshi floating farms with higher levels of water and regular flooding of fields. More and more people are developing floating farms that can react to the ebb and flow of water. The Arctic has gotten warmer, and there's been quite dramatic defrosting of the permafrost in Siberia, as well as the ice in the Arctic Ocean, and a brief video showing that methane bubbles that have been trapped in permafrost, the frozen ground there for hundreds, thousands of years, are now leading to these random explosions and divots in the earth that you can actually see from planes. And the last is the rising level of Bangladesh is an example of high water flows. The Sahel is an example of low water flows. The Three Gorges Dam, I took a boat ride down before it was completed, and we woke up, we went through what was then going to become the completed Three Gorges Dam early in the morning, and it was the largest thing I'd ever seen, right? It was something out of Star Wars. We have the crashed Death Star, that you saw something that was absolutely beyond your comprehension for how big it was. It was huge, and now you see with the the changing nature of weather patterns, that there are concerns that it wasn't built big enough, that there is a risk of flooding and needing to release water because of the estimates that were made 20 or 30 years ago about what the water flow would be and what the capacity would be is now changing given the reality that we are right now. So take a quick look at those. I think they'll be interesting, a visceral kind of example of the things we're going to look at, and then we'll come back and start by defining our terms. All right, see ya. I've got my coffee. I hope you do too.